The Unit 3 Vlog. Chapter 16. Cotton dominated the South. The Cotton Kingdom was alive and well and made Southern plantation owners and Northern cotton traders rich. The plantation system had its faults, but the wealth and power of the plantation owners made them an American aristocracy which dominated the society and politics of the South. Poor whites had to fend for themselves and compete with the slave labor. Many of the poor whites dreamed of buying a slave or two so that they could engage in the lucrative cotton market. Slavery was hitting its peak, with natural reproduction allowing the Southerners to breed their slaves and maintain a healthy population. Slave conditions varied from plantation to plantation, but inhumanity was constant amongst them. Abolition movements began to form, many of which had women at the forefront. Chapter 17. America felt the call of manifest destiny. Americans wanted to move west to take the prosperous lands in Texas and California. The land of the West was fertile, and despite the difficulty of Western life, people flooded west to claim their plots of land. The Mexican War gave Americans a chance to continue to move west unimpeded. American continental power seemed boundless. Life in the West could frequently be hard. Disease, starvation, famine, all of these things could wreck a person's life living in the West. However, continued expansion and warfare led to increased population in the West, which allowed them to overcome these difficulties by the virtue of population. Chapter 18. America's expansion renewed the sectional struggle by bringing up the problem of slavery in the territories. Many people supported popular sovereignty, whereby the territories could decide regarding slavery for themselves. However, the federal government decided to intervene based on popular opinion in the North that wanted slavery to stay in the South and not expand to the West. General Taylor caused a further problem by expanding America so quickly that new territories applied for statehood before America could deal with the sectional troubles. Settlers moving west to find gold in the California gold rush and the Underground Railroad increased these sectional tensions by forcing the new and old politicians to realize that compromises would not work for much longer. Chapter 19. America was heading towards disunion. Books like Uncle Tom's Cabin and The Impending Crisis of the South demonstrated that America could not survive much longer in its present condition. Conflicts in Congress, representatives beating senators, arguments, frustration led to continued conflict between North and South. A radical abolitionist named John Brown tried to cause a slave revolt to have the slaves rise up against their masters. The men in Congress, the people in politics, could not hold on to the Union much longer. They could barely hold on to themselves after Brooks caned Sumner. And then onto the scene came Abraham Lincoln, with his radical Republican ideas about freedom that were descended from the Free Soilers. The South could not tolerate it and seceded into the Confederate States of America. Chapter 20. The South had seceded. The conflict had begun. North and South had split, and neither the twain could meet for 4 more years. It began with the barrage of Fort Sumter. At this time, the South seemed like it couldn't possibly win. Its economy was entirely dependent upon cotton. It had very little manufacturing. The North had more soldiers, more politicians, more manufacturing, more abilities. But the South had greater leaders. In addition to this, the South had commerce raiders off the shore, damaging Union commerce and encouraging Britain and France to come in on its side. But in the end, Northern manufacturing would dominate Southern agriculture. Chapter 21. The war was in full effect. The North believed it would be an easy victory, but their constant defeats in the first couple years of the war proved this was not so. the South continued to march on. Its soldiers, barefooted, ragged, taking stuff from home, not issued any uniforms, but they were still well led. Men like Stonewall Jackson and other great Confederate generals led their men toward victory time and time again. Under the supreme command of Robert E. Lee, the South fought victory after victory in the early years of the war, and yet, in the last few battles of the war, the South could not win. The North's numbers and manufacturing superiority ultimately won out against Southern determination, and the Union was preserved. Chapter 22. The South was in ruins. The war had decimated its agriculture, economy, industry, transportation, production, and it became a military state, occupied constantly by Northern soldiers. Black soldiers had fought courageously during the war, and now occupied the plantations of their former masters. Northern manufacturing charged on, never impeded by the war, because very few of the battles had taken place in the North. The newly freed slaves became educated and learned their basics from groups like the Freedmen's Bureau, and they became a part of society. The assassination of Lincoln led to the presidency of Andrew Johnson, who had to assume all of the negative effects that Lincoln had left behind. Andrew Johnson was impeached by Congress, and he was a very unpopular president because of his policies. And women, despite soldiering on year after year, did not get the vote. While the Union had been preserved, Reconstruction would still be a long, hard road before America could finally be repaired. It would not be until the 1960s that blacks would finally get all of their civil rights attended to, and the black codes and other such laws of the South would severely damage the progress created by the Civil War. The Civil War left behind a legacy of blood, death, and turmoil, but it made the United States a singular, unified nation that would continue to grow and fight for glory in the decades to come.